Welcome to Sonoma County Master Gardener's webinar on creating wreaths from the garden and beyond, hosted by Sue Lovelace. The Sonoma County Master Gardener Organization has been serving home gardeners here in Sonoma County for almost 40 years. We're an organization of 244 volunteers who have been trained by the University of California, Davis. Our mission is to use the most current, unbiased, research-based information to help the home gardener find answers to many issues, including creating an edible food garden, selecting the right plant for the right place, safely managing pests and diseases, wise water use, and preparing your home to be fire resistant. Please visit our website at sonomamg.ucanr.edu to learn more about what we do. If you have a question, please write it in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Hover over the icon to begin text. Our session will be recorded. It will be available soon on the Sonoma Master Gardeners YouTube channel, along with many other interesting presentations. Please check them out. My name is Eartha, today's moderator, and I'll read your questions aloud after Sue's presentation. Allow me to begin by introducing today's presenter, Sue Lovelace, author of the blog Sundays with Sue, who will demonstrate how we can create wreaths from flora gathered from the landscape around us. Sue will show methods for harvesting, preserving freshness, and prepping materials. A Sonoma County Master Gardener since 2007, Sue lives in Cotati with her husband, Paul, a black lab named Poppy, and 5 chickens. Her gardening passions include an emphasis on pollinators, drought-tolerant plants, California natives, and perennial and heirloom varieties. Year-round food gardens allow Sue's family to eat organically and sustainably from the vegetable garden and numerous fruit trees. Although Sue's retired from floristry, her love for creating with botanicals from the garden and beyond is ongoing, and she's a past member and advocate of the Slow Flowers movement. Sundays with Sue is a vehicle for sharing with and learning from other gardeners the joys and some of the grief gardens and nature can offer. Visit Sundays with Sue on Facebook or on the Master Gardener website. It's delightful.
Welcome to my world of shelter-in-place wreath making. In this most virtual way, I'd like to share with you ways that I create wreaths from our garden and others' garden, as the case is today. And I hope you will join with me either today or another day and make it your own. When I talk about make it your own, I mean inserting your personality and your style in your wreath. In looking at these pictures, you will see these are from previous get-togethers, wreath get-togethers. You will see a variance of style, and that's what it's all about, making it your own. In fact, that's one of the biggest advantages of making it your own. There's other advantages as well. Next slide, please. So a wreath is a festive welcome. What's more welcoming than a wreath for the holidays? Freshness. When you make your own wreath, you know how fresh the material is, you know how it was handled, and you know where it came from. It exhibits personal style, as we already talked about, and can also highlight things in your garden that you enjoy. Here are a few supplies to have on hand. Clean cutters of all sizes. We're out pruning, so we want to have different size cutters. This cutter is really good for addressing floral wreaths, especially because in the center of it, it has a little groove that can cut wires. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a great little 2-for-1 tool. Clean buckets, important for gathering, for washing your flora, for soaking your flora. In the mornings are the best time to cut your floral material. And that's when they're undergoing the least amount of stress. And then you'll want to soak them, wash and soak them and put them in a cool place. I like to put them outside. Okay, wreath forms. Wreath forms come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. I like this particular one that you see in the picture. It's an easy style to wrap greens around, and I use it year after year. Easy to, nice and flat and easy to store. So I recommend it highly. Wires. In today's wreath, we are going to use paddle wires. And I recommend a 22 gauge. There are many gauges to wires. The lowest number is the thickest wire, which is an 18. A 22 is pliable enough, but strong enough to hold most materials in a wreath. I like covered wire. As you will see in the video, it's really great for using as a tool for attaching certain elements to your wreath. Here's a pine cone, and it wraps around a pine cone really easily, and then you can incorporate it in with your wreath. And so covered wires are great. They also have a twiggy appearance, and so can become part of the design. Let me just show you why I like them so much. This is like an herb swag. You can go out and collect your herbs, and then you can tie them with your covered wire or any of the wires, and create a wreath for your, or a swag for your porch to cut herbs from over the course of the winter. I wanted to show you this. This little wreath I've had on my wall for several years. It was actually my grandson's idea. It is from a fountain cherry, and I merely took the long vine-like branches and wrapped them around a wire, and then I attached them with some of my covered wire. Actually, I used a bark wire that looks actually like the wreath itself. Now, with the holidays coming, it was pretty easy to add some rosemary and some holly and maybe a little Santa and create a quick little wreath for your porch or for your bathroom. So wreath forms, wires, gloves, all important tools to have on hand. And let's talk a little bit about materials. So here are the forms. You see they come in all different shapes and sizes. Here are the cutters. They also come in all shapes and sizes. The wires, these are straight wires. These are going to be our key wires. They're the paddle wires. I recommend the flat over the round because the round tends to roll. Here's some ribbon if you choose to use ribbon. some covered wire, which I use a lot. It comes in a couple different colors, can be an accessory or a tool. Here is a blend of foliage. Here are some embellishments that you may have in your yard. I have pomegranates, lemons, pine cones, cinnamon. It's all what you want to put in your wreath. I tried to bring a variety. Some people like to put ornaments. A glue gun. I don't use one that often, but you might want to glue an ornament onto a stick. So glue gun is handy. These sticks are handy for wiring onto, so you can stick the embellishment in, or you can, like I say, glue this ornament onto. There are lots of accessories, but for this day, twine, wires, cutters, and forms are what we're going to use, and of course the foliage. From the video, you can see that we talked about some of the supplies and materials to have on hand. I just want to go over that sphagnum moss. You can get in bags at a floral supply, any place that sells floral supplies. The Flora itself, which are the greens and the fruit and the nuts and the different items, pine cones in your garden. Embellishments, which can be man-made or the natural focal elements of a wreath. All of these things are personal as far as what you want to include. And so let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more. Okay, so I'd like to encourage you to be adventuresome. As a hiker, I like to collect things on my walks, and then I like to incorporate them in wreaths. Right here, I wired wispy birch branches onto the wreath, and then I glue gunned different gulls and mossy wood and acorns and different elements that every time I saw this wreath, I thought of my walks. And I would encourage you to personalize your wreath in that way. Conifers and cones, they grow together, they look great together. Incorporating different highlights and shades together really pulls out all of the different textures within the wreath. Look at your landscape perennials. They experiment like I did with this leucadendron wreath. You know, it's amazing what you can come up with. Drought tolerant plants are really great in wreaths. They dry really well because they're kind of dry to start with. And look at your garden and use what's there. Herbs and fruit are great, and they're very efficient and very useful. Really pretty in a wreath, and as are mixed greens with the pines and the conifers and the evergreen trees all mixed together in different shades and different light. Really makes a nice wreath. Okay, and then you can take it to newer levels. Next slide. I want to highlight a couple wreath makers here in Sonoma County. They give workshops, and perhaps we'll even do a virtual workshop in the future. Kim Pearson has done presentations on succulents and succulent wreaths. And I'm sure you'll want to look for her name in the future. Ellen Pelican dazzles us with her wreath. If you look at this rosebud and persimmon wreath, how rose hip, rather, look how bright and wonderful this wreath is. And if you look at her other wreaths, they're full of texture, full of brightness, full of contrast. And that's what you want to work for when you're, creating a wreath. Okay, next slide, please. So we spent a wonderful day in Sara Malone's garden. And it's a 5-acre botanical arboretum. And she was gracious enough to tell us she had pruned her pines and we were welcome to use them. Even offered her garden for filming of the videos you see today. We saw the first video, so we're going to go on to the moss base slide, which is, let's see, here it is. Okay, so I mentioned sphagnum moss. Now, you may be wondering why I would use a moss base. It's not necessary. It's purely up to you. I like to use it because I feel it hydrates my wreath really well. It adds fluffiness, it adds natural material, and I use them quite often. So let's look at the moss base video, and you'll get an idea of putting it together. So here is a moss wreath base. It's sphagnum moss, more sustainable than the peat moss that comes from the bottom of the bogs, which is not sustainable. And I'm going to show you how we got to this base, and it's going to be the base for our wreath. Now we're going to soak the moss, and in order to do that, we'll want to break it apart so that the water can get in to all areas of the moss. We want a wet base because that's going to help hydrate the wreath. So let's let that soak a little, and we'll put a loop on the wreath so it'll be ready to go. So I'm going to attach the paddle wire to the loop, and some people like something to hang their wreath on. Others just use the middle of the wreath, but I'm going to attach this loop, which is pretty easy. Just wind the wire around it a couple times, and now you're ready to go. You're ready to wire on your moss. So this is pretty easy. We're going to wire this moss onto the wreath, and we attached our wires. So now we're just going to wrap the wire around the wreath. I'm going to take these gloves off now. These are great, by the way, for fooling around with moss. You can use them over and over. Okay, so it's just simple wiring of the moss. Because when you make the wreath, you're going to wire again. So this doesn't need to be wound as completely as the greens will be when they're applied to the moss base. See, this goes really fast. If you want a moss base, it's well worth the effort because it'll probably take me 5 to 10 minutes to do this. And once I get it done, the paddle wire will stay on the wreath for the greens. Now we have a finished base and it's all ready for the greens to go on. We're going to leave the paddle wire attached, and that way we can go right into wiring on the greens. So we're going to see a third video, and it's going to be on actually adding the main components to the moss base. The only point I wanted to make is that when you wire the first bundle, you are going to overlap the second bundle to cover the wire of that first bundle, and you'll repeat that throughout the wreath. Okay, let's look at the video. So I like a natural looking wreath. You know, other styles differ in that one might want a traditional evergreen conifer wreath, but I like the natural style. And so here are some elements I use to determine what I put on my wreath. For one, I like the different textures in the foliage. So if you see on this little grouping, I've got this little dancing foliage, this dark, that might go good with a pine cone in a different part of the wreath. One more thing, and I like to call these the dancers. It's the little wispy material that kind of adds movement to a wreath. And so I like to incorporate the dancers whenever I can. And this one is lots of different textures. And I just kind of group them to combine the dark and the light and the bright, which is the yellows, and the light greens are the bright. And this bay is dark, and a lot of the conifer is dark. Now when you have gray, it's a light, same with white. And so you want to combine, or at least I like to combine all those elements. As I'm combining the bundles, I may want to add a pine cone, or I may want to add a piece of fruit that I've left part of the stem on. This little grivia is a great way to add color. And so you're just kind of looking at that as you apply your greens and your bundles that have been cut anywhere from 6 to 12 inches. This is a eucalyptus with a little bit of pod, but notice the whirliness of it, and it is a great way to add movement to your wreath. It just adds a little bit of style. And so look for those things when you're making your wreath that you can add to create a personality or a effect. Now I'm going to attach some more bundles to the wreath. Looks like a lemon might go in this grouping. So let's get it attached, and you want to pull this wire tightly. And that's where the moss base really helps you. You can keep pulling until you feel like you have it on there securely. This bundle, I'm going to include this wispy material that I showed you earlier. And I want you to look at this little curly pine here and how it just adds to the texture of the wreath and gives personality. And you'll see as you go along how you can add different components to create a different effect in your wreath. Now I can look at this and I can say, when I hang it up, I can say, oh, I need a little more material here or a little more material there. That's where these sticks or this covered wire come in handy, because you can cut lengths and you can add extra material. You can glue gun a pine cone, or you can tie it. So you just go along the bottom. And this particular covered wire is very plant-like. And so it can either be a wispy part of the design, or it can just be tied in the back. Okay, so I talked about bundles in the video, and if you look at the upper picture, you'll see how in a wreath that's very full, I will plan out my bundles, and they're little groupings, as I mentioned, that can include your greens, your pine cones, all your flora. And you can space them out in a circle like you are creating the wreath, so that you have some balance. I try and balance my focal items in 3 parts of the wreath. And so I essentially did that here. These bundles ended up making the wreath in the lower right corner. It's not the wreath we made for Sara, but it is a similar kind of natural-like wreath. And sometimes when it's this big, it's great to plan ahead. And that's where the bundles are very helpful ahead of time. Okay, next slide. All righty, grapevine wreaths are great to have in your arsenal. They're beautiful in themselves, and they are a good way to make a wreath. They require little wiring because you can tuck a lot of the material in and underneath the weavings of the vine. And a grapevine wreath looks great with most materials, and you can keep reusing them year after year. If you look at the top picture, you will see that I made a bow and I put it on top of the wreath. I wired it with my covered wire. And from there, I dispersed the focal items, that's the lower left, around the wreath. Some I had to wire on, some I could just stick within the vines of the wreath. It depended on how strong their branch was. And then on the last wreath, you can see where I then tucked in leaves in the middle, in the middle, I tucked in leaves and other materials, and pretty soon I had a fall wreath. Now, a few weeks later, it was time to change over to another holiday. So I took off all the leaves, and it was pretty easy since a lot of the material was poked into the leaves. And then I left on the same bow, added a little bit of covered raffia, and then my orange slices in 3 spots, some berries, some of the same fruit, and then added more pine cones, sticking in or wiring on. It went pretty quick. And a lot of these greens are left over from Sara's, but a lot of them are also from my yard. And it ended up being a quick change to a different holiday. Okay, next slide. Then we have the decision, do we put a bow on our wreath or not? Well, often bows are put on wreaths to create a focal point. If you look in the left-hand picture, this bow is full of deer, and the wreath was made for a hunter. So I created this big bow, and then with material from the bottom of my Christmas tree, I started tucking in underneath and around, and they were long wisps that could go almost meet in the middle, and it ended up making a very nice wreath. I tied on some pine cones later, and the bell in the lower wreath, you will see that there's no bow, and the green bay made it look like a bow with the berries. And so in that case, definitely not necessary. Last year in Sara's garden, I created this wreath. She had this beautiful protea in her garden. And again, no need for a bow. Having a bow is a personal choice. It can create a focal point, or it can blend in like the lower wreath. It can blend in with the wreath itself. So just in case you wanted to have a bow, I'd like to show you a quick, here you go. Okay, here's a quick bow. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this loop. This ends up being the center loop of the bow. Then I'm going to make side loops off to each side. You can make as many as you want. I'll show you in a minute, depending on how big you want the bow to be. Okay, all right, so okay, so I'm not going to make it any bigger, because what I want to show you next is the last loop is going to be a very long loop, and that's going to be our streamers. So I'm going to use my wire to cinch the middle of this bow. Give it a few twists, and then I can cut it free from the roll. And this little trailer down here, I can cut it in two. And then you can fluff out the bow. And place your streamers wherever you want them on the wreath. And this goes pretty quickly, makes a pretty quick bow without adding different components. So anyway, that's the bow slide. And I'd like to sum up what we talked about today. And that is to go local whenever you can, into your own yard or someone else's yard, or even to a local establishment. Really important. And at this time, going local is totally advised. Prepare, like with the bundles, or not compare. You could be pruning out in your yard and say, Wow, this looks like a good amount of material for a wreath, and you can just go in and make a wreath. Consider the elements of design in balancing your wreath and combining textures and shades. And it makes for an interesting result. And make it your own. Add your own personality and style to the wreath and enjoy it. And above all, have fun while you're doing it. Happy holidays, everyone, and be safe and take care.
Thank you, Sue.
Yeah.
We do have a couple of questions. So let's get started with those. Oh, and on the screen right now, we have, for those of you who are seeing it, the QR code, which you can take your phone and scan. That will take you to the Master Gardener's YouTube channel, where you can view and save today's presentation. And you'll also be able to see a lot of other wonderful Master Gardener YouTubes. So Sue, we have a question from Paul, who asks, back to the bundle slide, are individual bundles bound or wrapped separately before being applied to the frame?
They can be, you know, they can be just grouped together and put on as a grouping, or you can bind them if you wanted to take the time to do it. And it's purely up to you. Maybe that is a good way to begin, creating bundles. Actually, a bundle could almost be a swag, and you can get creative within the bundle. I encourage you to do it. But bind or no bind, that's up to you. You could use that covered wire again, or you could use some of the paddle wire to bind them. It just depends on how you want to address. Sometimes the bundles are big and holding on to them could be tricky, but other times, it's just very convenient to keep adding the bundles without binding. Okay.
Thanks. So another question we have from Karen is, do you dry your own orange and lemon slices? And if so, how?
Okay. Long ago, I used to hang them up. I think I saw them on or in a craft magazine that you could hang them up and dry them, and you can. And I tried it and it worked out okay. Well, recently, another master gardener asked me if I wanted their dehydrator. And I said, sure. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been slicing oranges and laying them in the hydrator and drying them that way. So that was kind of fun. And I'm very lucky to have this hydrator, and thankful that the person who gave it to me offered it up.
Great.
So the probably drying the orange slices will work. I remember it worked, but it took a longer time to dry them. So
great.
yeah.
So we have a request that we show the QR code again, so it can be scanned. Let's do that at the end of the questions. But yes, we'll go ahead and do that. And while we're on the subject of citrus fruit, can you go over how to attach lemons again?
Sure. With most of my fruit, I like to pick them with the stem in place. And I use that stem. And the reason is, okay, you can run a wire through the bottom of this fruit and then take a stick and wire it to the stick, wire the lemon to the stick, but I like to use my lemons, and so I don't like to stick anything in them. They don't stay as fresh. So whenever I can pick a piece of fruit with the stem attached, I do it. And then I make sure I wire it and wire the stem really well to the wreath. So it's, it's steady. Let me just show you with this persimmon, same thing. I cut the branch along with the fruit. And then I wired that on. Actually, these I just include in my bundles. Let me just show you that I was talking about wiring pine cones, but here you can take like 3 of them and wire them together. And, I could even put it on a stick, wind it around a stick to stick in a wreath later on, or I can leave its tail or its leg. You're essentially adding legs to items that don't have their own leg, but I could wire this in with the bundle easily.
Well, Sue, while you're talking about wire, can you revisit the choosing the size and color of wire for Robin?
Sure. Are you the paddle wire? I'll just go over the whole wire part. The paddle wire is, I like the flat. You'll see it in round spools, and I've used it a lot in round spools. The only thing is as I mentioned in the video, it can go away from you. It can start rolling and roll off the table, and then you're on your hands and knees. So I like the green wire, and because it matches most of the greens that you put on a wreath, and it's a 22 gauge. Okay. And that is a good gauge that is pliable enough, but strong enough to hold greens. And if she's talking about the covered wire comes in green and brown, meant to look like a natural material, and it does when you incorporate it into a wreath. There's also something called the bark wire, and it looks like it was on this wreath here. It looks like bark. You can hardly tell that it's a wire. All of these things are available at a floral supply place, and they last for a long time. You can reuse them. I sound like a salesman for covered wire, but I really do use them a lot. They're comfortable on the hands, but the paddle wire is what you need for actually wiring greens to a wreath.
Well, thank you, Sue. I think you answered 2 questions at once there, because I think, Margot, your question about wrapped wire was also answered. I hope to your satisfaction. If you have another question, go ahead and write it again.
It's paper wrapped wire, by the way. If you're wondering what it's wrapped in, it's like a paper that they wind around a paper. There's also, and I think I showed you, but there's all colors of this raffia wire. And it's basically raffia that they put a wire in. Raffia is really fun, to use in wreaths, and I use it in its natural form a lot. But I also like the wired raffia, again, because I can keep reusing it, but also it's easy to manipulate, and it doesn't go haywire like raffia does on you after many years.
So thank you, Sue. We still have a little unclarity. Robin is asking, when do you use the, I'm sorry, I just lost the question.
It's okay.
Well, I'm not seeing it. I think the question was, when do you use the paddle wire versus the wrapped wire?
Okay, so paddle wire is a strong wire, okay? And so you're going to use paddle wire when you attach a greenery to your wreath. You know, greenery that could be from your shrubs, or in the case with Sara's pines, you need something that's not going to break on you, that you can pull really tight, and that's paddle wire. The wrapped wire, it's not strong enough to really pull. I think you can pull, but you really need to pull greens tightly to the wreath. And so I would consider this for instances where you want to attach something freely. Perhaps you could use it. I know we've used it with floral crowns where we were wiring floral crowns that we wanted it to look really natural. And so we used this covered wire, and it did fine. I mean, the floral crowns weren't something we really pulled tight on. And so that's where the paddle wire is what you want to use.
We have two questions regarding moss.
Okay.
One is asking if you could go over again briefly the sustainable versus not sustainable moss. And the other related question perhaps is, if you're using dried ingredients, do you still need to create a sphagnum base?
Okay, well, those are good questions. Okay, so it's the first thing about sustainable moss. We've all heard that peat moss is not sustainable. And the reason it's not is peat moss is found in the bottom of bogs. It takes hundreds of years to regenerate. And so essentially, we're depleting our bogs, okay, with peat moss. Sphagnum moss comes from the top of the bogs, and it regenerates more quickly. I mean, a lot more quickly, in that it's sustainable. And okay, the other question. Okay, using dry ingredients. I would not use, well, you could use a sphagnum moss, but you could use it dry. It kind of falls apart, or it kind of sheds a bit. So maybe something like Spanish moss that is, hangs on trees, grows on trees. I've seen them in Florida, is good for the dry arrangements, in that it is dry and you could use it dry and might be a little bit less shedding. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. And then we have two questions about the bow. Ursula is asking if you could demonstrate the bow technique again. And Paul, I believe, no, I'm sorry, Teresa is asking if there are written directions or pictures of bow assembly, of how to make them.
Well, I don't have that. Maybe I could create that in the future, but here's the basic. Okay, here's your ribbon. Your first loop is your center loop. And so then you make side loops, right? Here's the first side. There's the second side, right? And you keep going until you've created enough side loops to satisfy how big you want the bow to be. Then you kind of cinch it like that, right? The very last loop, and the reason I say loop is because you want this to be wired in with your center, because then you're not adding another trailer on the other side. I don't know if that makes sense at all. Okay, so you have, I hope you can see this. You have your center loop and your 2 side loops on each side. And this is wired ribbon, by the way. If you were using, say, ribbon that was not wired, you'd want to add extra twists to the bow when you went to each side to create a loop. And I know that sounds confusing, but okay, so here's your bow. Take this little piece of tape off. Okay, there's the bow with the big loop, right? That big loop now is really your little streamers. And there might be a better word, but I'm not thinking of it right now. And then you can kind of manipulate the little streamers to do what you want it to do on a wreath. See, you have the wire, you use the covered wire to bind the center of the bow. You can use paddle wire, but again, I like the ease of the covered wire. And then you're going to just attach it. You're going to attach it, and then you can spread it out and fluff up the little loops to achieve a bow that you're happy with. It's honestly, it's a great way to make a bow. And I hope this was helpful making it again. And if it's not, you know, I can address this later on with an instruction sheet. I think that was a good idea. And I could perhaps do that.
Sue, this is Cleo. I put in the chat area a link on how to make bows and 25 different kind of bows. It's really easy to Google. There's a lot of sites that have step-by-step guides on how to make bows.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Cleo. The reason and you might look for this when you Google the bow, the reason I like this bow is everything is done with one length of ribbon, you know, and it just goes together so quickly. I mean, you could use it with the tiniest of ribbon, you know, for like corsages or whatever. And so that's why I like it. So, but like you say, there's dozens of bow making videos. And hopefully, though, this second making of the bow was a little more clear as to how to do it.
Also, I will remind Teresa and others who would like more clarity on bow making that you can rewatch this video on YouTube. So it'll be available there.
It shows you. Yeah.
And then we also have 2 questions now that I think are well related. Anonymous asks, how do you lay the bundles around the wreath? How much do you overlap? And how many side to side? And I'll throw in Paul's question as well, because I think it relates nicely. Do you have tips for finessing the final bundle and then hiding the join elegantly?
Oh, those are good questions. Okay, so I like a very fluffy, very full wreath, like the one in the slide shown. So when I wire the first bundle, I am making sure that the second bundle is very close to the first bundle, and I am hiding all wires of the first bundle. And the question about how you face the material. When I first started out making wreaths, I would face a certain materials straight ahead, and this is within a bundle, and some to each side. And so then I was kind of assured that I would get a well-rounded wiring of the bundles. But actually now, because of the naturalness of the material, I basically lay it on the wire, and let me see if I can simulate it. I lay it on, there's some greens right here. Okay. I lay it on the wire, and I kind of have it facing out. And because it's a full bundle, there is lots still on the inside, but I tend to face my material a little bit to the outside. And that makes the wreath bigger. You know, this is a small wreath form, but by the time you're done with it, the wreath ends up pretty big. I would recommend, if this is your first time, maybe experimenting with how you like your greens facing, because you can do a grouping like this. It's hard to show you, but then you can add, you can always add to your bundle. See how I've added? And until you get a fullness that you think you're going to like throughout the wreath. And then when you get to the end, you're going to try and put the last bit of greens underneath what is now the first bundle, right? Because you're right where you started, but yet it's going to cover, still cover the wire. So it ends up something like being straight. It ends up something like this. So it kind of covers the wire of the last wreath or bundle you wired, but it also blends in with the first grouping. And sometimes having it blend in means turning it around and facing it in the opposite direction of the last bundle. And all this may sound confusing, except that when you go to do it, you'll know what I mean. You know, that last grouping, you may want to switch directions. You'll see how it best blends in with the wreath. I hope that answered that question. Sometimes experimenting, you know, is helpful to see how the positioning of the greens will go for you.
Now, Sue, I know you mentioned making wreaths with the grapevines.
Yes.
We have another question about, can you make a wreath without a wire frame? Are there other ways besides grapevine or grapevine like material?
Okay, so grapevines, you can definitely make them without a frame. A way that we used to do it is we would take 4 stakes. We had grapevines. We let our water go on our grapevines. We only had about 7. but you take stakes, and they're like 4 stakes, and then you're wrapping and you're putting that in the ground. Okay. And so then you're wrapping the wreath around the stakes. Okay. And then you're letting it sit there because it's then kind of the cellulose forms in the wood, and it ends up conforming to that shape. Now, can you do it with other materials? Besides grapevines, yes. Honeysuckle is a good one that you can create a round form. This one I liked. It was easy because I used the wire form, you know, and then I literally tied it to the wire form. But many of talented wreath makers have that art perfected, in that they can take vines and, you know, go circular with them. Some go square with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sue. And briefly, would you mind revisiting how to attach lemons to the wreath? We have another question about that.
Sure. Okay. First off, I like to leave the stem on all my fruit, because I don't like to go into the fruit, because then it spoils more rapidly, and actually I end up using the fruit if I don't puncture it. But you may not have that option, and so I'm not sure if this 22 will go through the lemon. Oh yeah, maybe it will. I'm going to show you that if I did have to puncture the fruit, I'll use this lemon later, don't worry. Okay, so you go through the fruit, and then you're going to bend down the wire. I went through the fruit with the wire at the bottom. Okay. And then I'm going to go like this. I'm going to take a green stick, or it could be even a branch, you know, a heavy branch if you don't have green sticks. And then I'm going to wind the wire around. Okay, I'll show you in a minute. Okay, there. See, I've made a leg for that lemon.
Wonderful.
And you can do that. Another thing, I don't know if I showed you, this little pomegranate, I took a stick, a green stick, and I just poked it in the end of the pomegranate. And that can be incorporated in with a bundle, believe it or not. Sometimes you have to break off the end of the stick so it, you know, doesn't show through. But I've done this for arrangements, you know, vase arrangements where you want fruit sticking out. It's called making a leg for your fruit. And you can do it with candles, where you make 3 legs around the base of a candle, and you put that in an arrangement. But yeah, there's lots of manipulations that you do with greenery to make things look natural.
Thank you, Sue.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's all for the questions that we have. Cleo, if you could possibly put the QR code back on the screen. We had a couple of people ask for that. And for those of you who are not able to scan it for any reason, you can just go to YouTube and look for Sonoma County Master Gardeners and see this and our other presentations. The QR is back up on the screen, and it looks like our time is nearing its end. So I want to thank everyone for attending this holiday presentation. We hope that you'll be inspired to design your own wreaths using the materials that grow all around you. Please do visit the UC Master Gardener website. You'll find that it's really a treasure trove of information and articles on many subjects, fire-wise gardening, water-wise use, Garden Sense program, as well as a list of other upcoming events.
Eartha, can I say one more thing?
Oh, please.
I'm on the Sonoma County Master Gardener Facebook page every Sunday. And I would invite anyone that has any questions or anything that they'd like to ask me or comment on, join me there because it is a great exchange. If I don't know the answer, then there's probably a gardener that is writing in that can answer it for me. So I'd welcome anyone who wanted to visit on Sunday, all day Sunday.
Yes, it's absolutely wonderful. For those of you who haven't checked it out, please do. It's marvelous. And also explore, again, the Master Gardener website, as well as Master Gardeners on Facebook, also Sundays with Sue, and Pinterest, Instagram, and YouTube. And again, thank you so much for attending, everyone, and happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy holidays.